Officers Calloway and Reeves saw a black man behind the wheel and instantly decided he was guilty. They had done it before, harassed, brutalized, and walked away without consequence. But this time, they pulled over the wrong black man. Michael Harris, a former Delta Force commander, along with his pregnant wife, Sarah. What started as routine intimidation spiraled into something far worse. Accusations turned into threats. Control turned into cruelty. And when Sarah tried to intervene, they threw her to the ground, crushing more than just her body. The officers went home that night without a second thought. No suspensions, no investigations, no consequences. But this time, the consequences are coming. Michael Harris is done waiting for justice. He was going to deliver it himself. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The glow of headlights stretched across the quiet highway, cutting through the darkness in long, steady beams. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them, the rhythmic motion of the road, a quiet lullaby. Sarah leaned against the window, her fingers resting against the swell of her stomach, her gaze distant, yet warm. "I've been thinking," she murmured, the quiet intimacy of the night making her voice softer, more thoughtful. "What if we name him Ethan?" Michael glanced at her, one hand steady on the wheel, the other reaching across the console to take hers, her fingers curled around his, warm and familiar. "Ethan," he echoed, testing the name on his tongue. She nodded, watching him closely. "Strong name, isn't it?" His lips curled into a slight smirk, a rare softness breaking the sharp edges of his face. "It is," Sarah smiled, leaning into his touch. "I knew you'd like it." The road stretched ahead, empty and open, the air thick with quiet promises of the future. But then, a flicker of blue and red in the rearview mirror. Michael's eyes shifted instinctively, watching as the patrol car inched closer, its headlights flaring bright. A routine stop, or at least, that's what it should have been. Sarah shifted beside him, her grip on his hand tightening just slightly. "Do you think?" she started. But Michael was already slowing the car, guiding it toward the shoulder with practiced ease. The patrol car followed, pulling in behind them. Michael exhaled slowly, his voice low and steady. "It's just a traffic stop." Sarah nodded, but her posture remained rigid, her fingers now twisting in the fabric of her dress. Outside, the officers approached, their footsteps crunching against the gravel. Two of them, one on each side of the car. The first officer, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smirk that seemed carved into his face, stepped forward, bending slightly as he peered through the window. His badge read, "Calloway." "Evening," he drawled, his voice thick with the kind of authority that wasn't meant to reassure, but to establish dominance. Michael nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Evening, officer." The second cop, stockier, with a coiled impatience humming beneath his stance, circled toward Sarah's side. "Reeves." Calloway tilted his head slightly, his smirk widening. "Little late to be out, don't you think?" Michael met his gaze, unshaken. "Didn't realize there was a curfew." Calloway chuckled under his breath, but there was no amusement in it, just something slow and simmering, like he was waiting for an excuse. Reeves tapped his flashlight against the glass of the passenger side window, making Sarah flinch. Michael felt her fingers tighten around his. His jaw flexed, but his voice remained level. "Is there a problem, officer?" Calloway exhaled through his nose, flipping open his notepad. "License and registration." Michael moved carefully, keeping his motions deliberate as he reached into the glove compartment, retrieving the documents and passing them through the window. Calloway took them with lazy disinterest, barely glancing at them before his gaze drifted toward Sarah. His smirk deepened. "That your wife?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Something in Calloway's tone made his fingers tighten slightly against the wheel. Calloway nodded slowly, eyes flicking toward her stomach before turning back to Michael. "Guess congratulations are in order." Michael forced a tight smile, unwilling to give him anything to twist. "Thanks." Calloway hummed, then turned the license over in his hand, eyes scanning it. "Military, huh? Delta Force." He let out a low whistle. "That's supposed to impress me?" Michael exhaled, already tired of this game. "Not unless you're hiring." The joke was light, the tone effortless, something meant to ease the tension. But the moment the words left his mouth, Calloway's smirk vanished, his expression turning ice-cold. A slow, uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Reeves's chuckle was low and sharp. "Funny guy." Calloway leaned in just slightly, his fingers tapping against the roof of the car. "You think this is a joke?" Michael's smirk faded. "No, officer, just making conversation," Calloway scoffed, stepping back slightly. But there was a new stiffness to his posture, a barely contained flicker of something dangerous beneath his skin. Then, just as suddenly, his smirk returned. But this time, it was sharper. "Step out of the vehicle." Michael remained still. "On what grounds?" Calloway's smirk didn't waver, but the amusement in his eyes had turned into something colder. "On the grounds that I said so." Michael didn't move, didn't blink. Sarah shifted beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Michael?" Reeves tapped the glass again, harder this time. "You deaf?" Michael exhaled slowly, forcing his muscles to remain loose, his voice calm. "We haven't done anything wrong." Calloway's smirk widened. "See, that's the thing. It's not about what you did. It's about what I say you did." The words sat between them, thick with unspoken threat. Sarah's grip on his wrist tightened. Michael glanced at her, then back at the officers. He had seen this before. He knew how this went. And in that moment, he realized something. It was never going to matter how he responded. Calloway had already made up his mind. Michael inhaled, then slowly reached for the door handle. Outside, Calloway took a step back, his smirk never faltering, his stance loose, casual, but waiting. Reeves shifted behind him, fingers resting too comfortably near his belt, too close to his holster. Michael stepped out, straightening, feeling the cool night air against his skin. Calloway was sizing him up now, eyes flicking over his stance, searching for any excuse, any hesitation, any sign of resistance. He found none, but it didn't matter. Hands on the car. Michael didn't move. Reeves let out a slow, amused breath. "That was an order." Sarah's voice cut through the moment, her tone fragile but pleading. "Michael, please." His fists clenched. He had played by the rules, followed every order, de-escalated at every turn. But it had never mattered. And now, standing there beneath the flashing red and blue glow, watching Calloway's smirk twist into something uglier, he knew it never would. He placed his hands on the car. And behind him, Calloway smiled. The evening was just beginning. Michael stood beside the car, his body still, his breathing even, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight beneath the surface. He had been in situations like this before, where men who had never fought a day in their lives enjoyed the feeling of power too much. He had seen this exact posture in corrupt warlords, in rookie soldiers trying too hard to prove themselves, in men who thrived not off of control, but the ability to take it from someone else. Calloway wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for a reaction. Michael wasn't going to give him one. Yet, Calloway stood just a little too close, fingers tapping lazily against his belt. His smirk stretched wide with amusement. He held Michael's license in his hand like it was nothing more than a scrap of paper, barely glancing at it before his lips curled. "Delta Force," he muttered, dragging out the words like he was savoring them. "You one of those tough guys?" Michael exhaled slowly, keeping his tone steady. "Something like that." Calloway chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know your type." Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to. Reeves, still circling the car like an animal waiting for the kill, tapped his flashlight against the passenger side window again. Louder this time, intentionally sharp. Sarah flinched. Michael's gaze snapped to him instantly, voice firm, cutting through the thick night air. "Leave her alone." Reeves turned to him slowly, smirking. "That's supposed to be an order?" Michael held his stare, his voice like stone. "That's my wife. You don't talk to her. You don't touch her. In fact, don't even look at her." Calloway let out an amused whistle, shaking his head. "Damn. Protective, huh?" He turned toward Sarah, his smirk widening. You feel safe with this guy, sweetheart? Sarah's fingers curled in her lap, but she didn't hesitate. I felt safer before you pulled us over. Reeves chuckled, pacing around the car again. Oh, she got a mouth on her. Sarah glared at him. And you have an ego so fragile it's pathetic. Reeves's smirk vanished. Calloway, sensing the shift, leaned against the car like he had all the time in the world. You know, he mused, glancing at Michael, I can see why you married her. Pretty little thing, but you gotta teach her to know when to keep quiet. Michael inhaled slowly, his hands curled just slightly at his sides, his pulse drumming slow and steady, his mind already cataloging the space between them, the weight shifts, the angles. Sarah, voice edged with controlled fury, snapped, Don't talk about me like I'm not here. Calloway's smile widened. Don't worry, sweetheart. I see you. Michael stepped forward before he could stop himself. Just an inch, just enough to make his point. And I see you, he said, voice dropping low. Calloway's smirk faltered for half a second. Then, slowly, deliberately, it returned. Damn, this one's feisty, he muttered toward Reeves. Reeves, his irritation still simmering from Sarah's words, took the opening, his voice laced with venom. Guess that's what happens when they get taken out of their place. Michael's breath left his body in one long, measured exhale. He saw Sarah stiffen out of the corner of his eye, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. Calloway, sensing an opening, turned back toward Michael, lowering his voice. You keep this up, Graves. You're gonna make me think you've got something to hide. Michael forced himself to relax his fingers, to keep his expression unreadable. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to snap. He wouldn't, but he wouldn't stay silent either. His voice was steady, calm, each word deliberate. I didn't do anything. My wife didn't do anything. You pulled us over because you could, not because of any law. And now you're trying to provoke me. He let the words settle before adding, That means I already won. Calloway's expression darkened. Reeves's smirk twisted. The kind of look men gave when they were deciding between fight or flight, and knew exactly which one they'd choose. Calloway straightened, nodding slightly. Yeah, I think I've had just about enough of this. He took a step forward, resting a hand on his belt, right near his cuffs. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Michael didn't move. Sarah's voice immediately rose in alarm. What? For what? Calloway didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked onto Michael's, driving under the influence. Michael exhaled sharply through his nose. His patience was thinning. You know that's not true. Calloway's grin stretched wider. Then prove me wrong. Sarah leaned forward, her panic rising. He hasn't been drinking, and you know that. Reeves scoffed, stepping closer, muttering, Damn, you don't shut up, do you? Michael turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. His voice was ice. Touch her, and I swear to God, you won't make it home tonight. Reeves hesitated. Calloway let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, shaking his head like he was so exhausted by the situation. See? This is why I don't like your type. Always thinking you're the smartest guy in the room. Always thinking you're the toughest guy in the room. Michael's voice was quieter now, colder. I don't think anything. Calloway chuckled, but it was thin, strained. The tension was shifting, slipping out of his control. He didn't like that. His grip tightened on his belt. Last chance. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Michael felt Sarah's eyes on him, pleading, terrified. He could hear her breath hitching, could feel the way her entire body was bracing for what came next. If he fought back, it wouldn't end here. Not tonight. Not with her sitting right there. Slowly, deliberately, he turned. Calloway grinned, stepping in, grabbing his wrist with too much force. The cuffs came down hard over his skin, biting into his flesh, and before he could adjust to the pressure, Calloway yanked his arms roughly behind his back, pulling harder than necessary, just to prove a point. Michael clenched his jaw, swallowing the pain. He heard Sarah let out a sharp breath, heard her shift in her seat as if she wanted to move, to get out, to intervene. But she didn't, not yet. Calloway shoved him forward, pushing him up against the side of the car. Welcome to the real world, hero, he he muttered. Michael didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't give them the satisfaction. The night air was thick, suffocating, pressing down on Michael's skin as he knelt on the rough pavement, his muscles coiled, his breath steady but slow. He knew what was happening. He had seen this play out before, in different places, under different circumstances, with different men who wore the same expressions. Calloway and Reeves weren't following the law. They were following a script they had written themselves, one where they decided who was guilty, who was powerless, who was at their mercy. Michael had played along as long as he could, but there were limits. Calloway pressed a hand on his shoulder, fingers digging in, forcing him down just a little more. "That's better," he murmured, voice smug. "See? You listen. And this doesn't have to be difficult." Michael's jaw tightened, his wrists straining slightly against the cuffs. He felt Sarah's eyes on him, could hear her uneven breathing from the car. The way she was gripping the dashboard so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Michael," she called, her voice laced with warning. Calloway sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "Your wife sure does talk a lot." Michael ignored him, forcing himself to breathe evenly. "You've got what you wanted. You made your point. Let's get this over with." Reeves let out a short laugh, stepping closer. "Oh no, see, I don't think we're quite done here." He crouched slightly, looking Michael in the eye. "We gotta pat you down, make sure you're not hiding anything." Michael didn't flinch, didn't move. "You already have me in cuffs." Reeves grinned. "Yeah, but we like to be thorough." Calloway leaned in slightly, voice lowering to something almost conspiratorial. "Unless you want to make this difficult." Michael exhaled, long and slow. He knew where this was going. But before he could answer, Sarah spoke again, her voice sharp, her fear now fully edged with anger. "You have him in cuffs. He can't do anything. This is harassment, and you know it." Reeves rolled his eyes, his patience thinning. "Lady, I swear, if you don't keep quiet—" Michael cut him off, his voice cold and controlled. "You don't talk to her like that." Reeves tilted his head, something flashing in his expression, something ugly. He glanced at Calloway, smirking. "You hear that? He's real protective." Calloway nodded, playing along. "Yeah, thinks he can tell us how to do our jobs." Reeves hummed, stepping behind Michael, grabbing his shoulders with a grip far rougher than necessary. "Let's fix that attitude." The sudden force made Michael shift his stance instinctively, his body tensing as they yanked him forward, forcing him lower to the ground. His knee scraped against the pavement. But he didn't react. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But Sarah wasn't having it. "Stop! You're hurting him!" Calloway sighed, glancing toward the car like she was nothing more than a nuisance. "You really don't know when to stop talking, do you?" Michael twisted slightly, despite the pressure on his back, his voice sharper now. "Leave her alone." Reeves let out a low chuckle. "See, this is your problem, Graves. Always trying to be the hero." Sarah was out of the car before Michael could stop her, her steps quick and purposeful as she moved toward them. "You can't do this. He hasn't done anything wrong." Reeves turned toward her, exhaling hard, clearly losing patience. "All right, I've had enough of this." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Michael saw red. The reaction was instant. He moved, body twisting, his muscles straining against the hold they had on him, every instinct roaring to break free, to tear them off of her. Calloway shoved him down hard. "Stay down." Michael barely registered it. His focus was on Sarah. She yanked her arm back with force, stumbling slightly before regaining her footing, her breath quick, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. "Get your hands off me!" Reeves lunged for her again, this time going for her other arm, his grip tightening as he yanked her toward him. She fought. She twisted, pushing against him, trying to break free, her voice rising. "Let go of me!" Michael was thrashing now, trying to push up, to get to her, to do something. Then, a sharp electric crackle. Pain erupted through his body. Michael's back arched violently, his muscles seizing as the taser connected, his nerves lighting up in a white-hot explosion of agony. The world blurred. His breath vanished. His body hit the pavement, twitching, spasming, his brain barely able to process the chaos unfolding around him. And then Sarah screamed. Michael forced himself to move, to push past the burning in his limbs, the electricity still firing through his nerves. He lifted his head just in time to see Reeves slam Sarah down onto the pavement. The impact was brutal. Her body twisted, her arms instinctively going around her stomach, her breath coming in a sharp, strangled gasp. And then, silence. Michael didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't feel the lingering pain in his body. All he knew was that she was down. All he knew was that they had done this. The world was a blur of motion, his heartbeat deafening in his ears, his body surging forward despite the hands pressing him down. Calloway moved first, a boot pressed against his back, shoving him against the pavement, a voice, sharp and taunting, cutting through the chaos. "Where do you think you're going?" Michael struggled, gritted his teeth, his entire body straining. Another burst of pain. The taser hit him again, stealing the strength from his limbs, forcing him down as his vision flickered, his chest heaving. And still, his eyes never left her. Sarah, curled on the ground, her breath shallow, her hands gripping her stomach like she was trying to hold something together. Reeves straightened, rolling his shoulders, exhaling hard. "She should have stayed in the car." Calloway nodded, adjusting his belt, smirking down at Michael. "Guess that's 2 arrests tonight." Michael barely heard them, barely felt the pressure of their weight. The cuffs cutting into his skin, the pavement scraping his cheek, because something deeper, something darker, had settled inside of him. A quiet, terrible stillness. This wouldn't end here. Not for them, not for him. And as Calloway and Reeves stood above him, laughing, still believing they had won, Michael made a silent promise. They had no idea what they had just done, but they would. Michael felt the weight of his own breath pressing against his ribs, the cold pavement beneath his cheek, an anchor that held him still, even as his body screamed to move. The taser had stolen the strength from his limbs, but not his mind, not the fire burning behind his eyes, not the rage sitting low in his stomach, coiled tight, waiting for release. His muscles twitched as the electricity faded, a slow, agonizing return to awareness. And then he heard her, Sarah, crying, not loud, not sobbing, just a quiet, breathless sound, one that came in short, uneven gasps, like she was trying to breathe through the pain and failing. His chest ached with it, deeper than the bruises already forming, deeper than the cuffs biting into his skin. He forced his head up, his vision swimming before settling on her. Still on the ground, curled in on herself, her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. She was shaking. Reeves stood over her, rolling his shoulder like he had done something strenuous, like slamming a woman to the pavement had taken effort. Michael clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth felt like they might crack. Calloway let out a low chuckle, stepping back, his stance loose, relaxed, utterly at ease with what had just happened. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head, "look at you two." He nudged Michael's side with his boot. Not hard, not enough to hurt, just enough to remind him that he could. What happened to all that fight? Michael's fingers twitched against the pavement, his entire body taut, his breath slow and steady through his nose. He didn't respond, not yet. Reeves exhaled, crouching slightly near Sarah, his grin sharp. She's a lot quieter now. Michael's vision blurred with red. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her body shifting slightly, trying to sit up. The moment she moved, Calloway let out a mocking whistle. "Uh-oh. Look alive, Graves. Looks like your lady's trying to get up." Michael's breath hitched, his entire body strained against the cuffs, the muscles in his shoulders burning with the effort, but the weight of Calloway's boot pressing against his back kept him pinned. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Michael," Calloway smirked. "Oh, she's calling for you." Reeves laughed. "Cute." Michael's breathing deepened. He knew this game. He had seen men play it before, in different uniforms, under different flags. They weren't just exerting power. They were enjoying it. He closed his eyes for half a second, forced himself to exhale slowly through his nose, forced the rage to stay where it was, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting. Because now wasn't the time, but it would come. Calloway crouched slightly, dropping his voice. "This what you trained for, soldier boy?" He patted Michael's back like they were old friends, like they were anything but enemies, locked in a war neither had fully acknowledged yet. All that time in the desert, all that discipline, all that fight, just to end up face down in the dirt while your wife cries? Michael opened his eyes, his gaze locked onto Calloway's, slow and deliberate. Something behind them shifting, something so dark and calm that, for the first time that night, Calloway's smirk faltered. Not for long, just a second. A flicker of hesitation. Then, just as quickly, he recovered, exhaling through his nose, shaking his head. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Reeves stepped back, wiping his hands together like he was done. Like this was just another routine traffic stop. "All right, let's get him in the car." Michael barely registered, being yanked to his feet. His body moved on instinct, his balance adjusting even as Reeves gave him an unnecessary shove forward, guiding him toward the patrol car. Sarah. He turned his head, searching, his breath catching when he saw her still on the ground, her body trembling, her face pale, but her eyes were locked onto him, desperate, terrified, pleading, and something else. Something broken. He didn't look away, not even as Reeves shoved him against the patrol car, forcing him inside. He let her see him. Let her see that this wasn't over, that it would never be over. She was still watching him as Calloway grabbed her arm, dragging her up roughly, guiding her toward the other squad car. She stumbled slightly, her face contorting in pain, her free hand still clutching her stomach. Michael felt his teeth grind. His breathing was slow, measured, controlled, but barely. She caught his gaze again just before the door slammed shut, and then she was gone. The world outside the patrol car was a blur of flashing lights and dark silhouettes, of distant murmurs, and the quiet hum of static from the radio. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears, his hands flexing uselessly against the restraints as the car lurched forward, pulling them away from the scene, pulling them toward whatever came next. Calloway was driving, Reeves in the passenger seat, both of them far too relaxed, too at ease with what had just happened. The radio crackled occasionally, but otherwise the car was quiet, too quiet, until Calloway sighed, shaking his head. "You know," he mused, glancing at Michael through the rearview mirror, "I really don't get guys like you." Michael didn't respond, didn't move. Calloway continued anyway, like he was enjoying the sound of his own voice. "You get out of the service, you get yourself a nice little life, a pretty little wife, and still can't help yourself. Still gotta be the tough guy. Still gotta act like you're in charge." Reeves snorted. "Yeah, how'd that work out for you tonight?" Michael stared out the window, watching the town pass in a blur of streetlights and darkened storefronts. Calloway hummed. "See, that's what I don't get. You're smart, right? Gotta be, to make it through all that training. So you had to know how this was gonna go. You had to know the second you started running your mouth, you were gonna end up in cuffs." Michael finally spoke, his voice low, even. "You were going to do this no matter what I said." Calloway let out a short laugh, amused. "See? Smart guy." Michael turned his head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes in the mirror. His voice was calm, too calm. "So, why ask questions you already know the answers to?" Calloway's smirk twitched. Reeves chuckled. "Man, you just don't know when to quit." Michael held his gaze a second longer before looking away, not in submission, not in defeat, but because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. The station lights were up ahead now, bright and sterile, illuminating the night with an artificial glow. The car slowed, pulling into the lot, coming to a stop just outside the processing area. Calloway turned slightly in his seat, grinning over his shoulder. "Well, soldier boy," he said, "welcome to your new home." Michael exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing, his body still, his mind already moving forward. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The walls of the holding cell pressed in around Michael, the dim yellow light casting long shadows across the concrete, the air thick with something stale and suffocating. His body ached from the night before, his muscles stiff from the hours spent against the cold bench, his wrists raw from the metal cuffs that had been locked too tight for too long. But none of it mattered, not compared to the way Sarah sat beside him. She was hunched forward slightly, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath coming in slow, uneven pulls. She hadn't spoken in minutes, barely moving, staring blankly at the floor, her fingers curled in her lap, gripping nothing. Michael exhaled slowly, controlling the rage pressing against his ribs, forcing himself to focus on her, not on the officers laughing at the front desk, not on the fact that Reeves had walked past their cell twice already, smirking like he had won something. He shifted closer, his voice low but firm. "Sarah." She didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. His throat tightened. He reached for her hand carefully, as if afraid she might shatter beneath his touch. She let him take it, but her grip was weak, her fingers barely curling around his. That was when he knew. The rage in his chest sharpened into something heavier, something colder, something that settled into his bones like steel. He turned his head toward the bars, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence with a force that made the officers at the front desk glance up. "She needs a doctor." No response. He forced himself to stay still, to breathe, to control the way his hands curled into fists against his knees. He tried again, his voice even harder this time, his patience hanging by a thread. "She needs a doctor." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, barely paying attention, flipped a page in his paperwork and muttered, "She looks fine." Michael's body went completely still. Every ounce of discipline, every rule he had lived by, everything he had learned about restraint, it all teetered on the edge of collapse. Then his voice came, quiet, steady, and lethal. "You're going to get her a doctor. Now!" Something in his tone made the officer's fingers hesitate on the paper, made the younger one beside him glance up warily. There was a long, heavy pause. Then, finally, a sigh. "I'll call someone." Michael didn't move, didn't react, didn't let even a flicker of relief cross his face. Because this wasn't mercy, this was survival. Minutes passed before a door opened down the hall, and a woman in medical scrubs was led toward the cell. She didn't hesitate, her eyes flicking over Sarah, assessing quickly before turning to the officer beside her. "She needs to be taken to the hospital." The officer frowned. Michael rose to his feet so fast the bench scraped loudly beneath him, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Now." The officer hesitated. Michael held his gaze, unblinking, unyielding. Then, after a slow exhale, the officer turned and muttered something into his radio. A moment later, the keys rattled in the lock, and two more officers stepped in, guiding Sarah toward the exit. She turned her head as they led her away, her eyes locking onto Michael's. "Michael!" "I'll be there," he said, voice steady, voice sure. She nodded. Then she was gone. The door slammed shut. Michael stood in the same spot for a long time, his breath even, his fists loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. The laughter from the front desk started up again, low murmurs of conversation, the occasional chuckle, the sound of a coffee cup setting down. They thought it was over. They thought this was just another night. They had no idea. Time moved strangely after that. Hours blurred together, the weight of waiting pressing in, the fluorescent lights above him flickering, the distant hum of voices, a dull, meaningless sound. He didn't sleep, didn't close his eyes, just sat on the bench, back straight, hands on his knees, waiting. Eventually, someone came. Not Calloway, not Reeves, just another officer. This one younger, looking vaguely uncomfortable as he unlocked the door, stepping back like he didn't want to be too close. "You're free to go. Sign here." Michael stood slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling the stiffness in his muscles, the ache settling deep into his bones. "Where's my wife?" His voice was level. But it wasn't a question, it was a demand. The officer hesitated, then stepped aside. Hospital released her an hour ago. Michael's pulse pounded. His jaw flexed. What happened? The officer shifted uncomfortably, already turning back toward the hall. Ask her yourself. Michael didn't move at first, just stood there, staring after him, feeling the sharp, quiet tremor of something deep in his chest. Something heavy, something final. Then he walked out. A crisp, early morning breeze hit his skin as he stepped outside, the brightness of the rising sun pressing against the dull ache in his skull, the exhaustion in his limbs. But he barely noticed it, because Sarah was there, standing just a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself, her posture tense, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. And the moment she saw him, something inside her cracked. Michael moved before she did, his feet closing the space between them, his hands finding hers, his touch careful, steady, grounding. Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around his, her body trembling slightly. She looked up at him, her lips parting, her voice breaking before she could even speak. Then, barely a whisper, "He's gone." Michael felt his entire body go still. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers clenching around his. The baby. Michael didn't breathe, didn't blink. Sarah's voice shook. "Ethan," she inhaled sharply, her breath catching in her throat. "He's gone." Michael stared at her, his mind refusing to register the words, his body locked in place, frozen in a moment that shouldn't exist, that shouldn't be real, that shouldn't have happened. Something inside him cracked open, slow and terrible, the kind of break that couldn't be stitched back together, the kind that didn't heal. She wasn't crying. Not anymore. She had cried all she could. Now, there was only emptiness. Michael felt his jaw tighten, his breath slow, controlled, deliberate. Sarah shook her head slightly, her grip on him tightening, her body swaying just slightly, unsteady. And finally, Michael moved. He pulled her in, wrapping his arms around her, holding her against his chest as she trembled, as the weight of everything pressed down on them both. His fingers curled against the fabric of her shirt, his jaw pressing against the top of her head as he exhaled slow, controlled, feeling her heartbeat against his. He didn't say anything, because what words could exist for something like this? They stood there, unmoving, the world continuing around them as if nothing had changed, as if everything they had built, everything they had dreamed, hadn't been torn apart in a single night. Michael's fingers curled slightly, tightening his hold just a little more. There was no anger yet, no fury. Not yet. Right now, there was only this: the grief, the loss, the unbearable silence of a future stolen before it had a chance to begin. Right now, there was only Sarah, shaking in his arms, and the quiet, empty space where their son was supposed to be. The house felt different. It wasn't just the quiet, the kind that settled too deep, too thick, pressing into the walls like something permanent. It wasn't even the dim light filtering through the closed curtains, casting long, muted shadows across the furniture. It was something else. Something wrong. Michael stood in the doorway, his fingers still curled around the handle, his breath slow and even, his pulse a steady drum in his ears. He had walked through this door 100 times before, had memorized the creak in the floorboards, the way the air smelled faintly of the coffee Sarah made every morning, the subtle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But now, every detail felt distant, like a memory that no longer belonged to him. Sarah moved past him, her steps slow, almost hesitant, as if she, too, was stepping into a place that no longer felt like home. She didn't take off her shoes, didn't turn on the lights, didn't move toward the couch or the kitchen or the bedroom. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on nothing, lost somewhere he couldn't reach. Michael let the door close behind him, the soft click echoing too loud in the silence. His voice was careful, low. "What did the doctors say?" Sarah inhaled sharply, just once, like she was trying to brace herself, but she didn't answer right away. Michael took a step closer, keeping his tone steady. "Sarah," she blinked, her shoulders stiffening, as if she had forgotten he was there. Slowly, she exhaled, her voice quiet, hollow. They said. She hesitated, her fingers curling against her sleeves. There was nothing they could do. Michael felt something tighten in his chest, sharp and unforgiving. Was it? He swallowed, forcing the words out. Was it from the fall? Sarah nodded, barely, her eyes still unfocused. They said the impact was too much, too sudden. Another breath, unsteady, fragile. I already knew before they told me. Her fingers curled tighter against her arms, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt it. Michael's jaw tensed, his fists clenched at his sides before he forced himself to relax, to breathe, to stay still. His mind flashed back to the moment it had happened, the way she had gasped, the way her body had curled instinctively, the way she had tried to hold something together that had already begun slipping away. His voice was quiet. Did they treat you? Sarah nodded again, slower this time. They ran tests, did an ultrasound. Her breath hitched slightly. There was no heartbeat. Michael felt the words hit somewhere deep, somewhere that hadn't caught up with the rest of him yet. No heartbeat. He closed his eyes for a brief second, just long enough to press the weight of the words into his ribs, into his bones, into the quiet, seething storm building beneath his skin. Sarah let out a shaky breath. They gave me something to help with the pain. Her arms tightened around herself again. Not that it really matters. Michael opened his eyes. He didn't move toward her yet, didn't reach for her, because he knew that if he touched her now, if he pulled her in, if he let himself feel the full weight of what had been taken from them, the grief would be too much, too consuming, too deep to crawl out of. And one of them had to hold on, even if it was only for a little while. He exhaled slowly. Did they say anything else? Sarah shook her head. They told me to rest, to come back if there were complications. A hollow laugh, barely there, like I'd want to go back. Michael's jaw flexed. He knew exactly what she meant. She lifted a hand to her face, pressing the heel of her palm against her temple. Her breath uneven again. I keep thinking, her voice faltered, cracking at the edges. I keep thinking about how I was holding him, like that was going to protect him. Michael's stomach twisted. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wet, but the tears didn't fall. I couldn't save him. Michael stepped forward before she could say anything else, closing the space between them, his hands moving to her arms, pulling her in gently but firmly, holding her close, feeling her body tremble against his. His voice was quiet but steady. Neither could I. She inhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, her body pressing into his as if she could fold herself into him, disappear into something safe, something solid. He held her tighter, pressing his lips against the top of her head, closing his eyes as she let out a single, shuddering breath, her hands fisting against his chest. They stood like that for a long time, neither of them moving, neither of them speaking. The silence stretching between them, heavy and suffocating. Michael felt every inch of it settle into his bones, every second, every heartbeat that no longer existed. Sarah shifted slightly, her breath evening out, but she didn't pull away. Her voice was quiet, barely there. I don't know what to do. Michael opened his eyes, staring at the darkened room, at the pieces of their life that still sat untouched, as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. He exhaled slowly, pressing his chin against her hair, his arms still wrapped tightly around her. I don't either. And for the first time since that night had begun, he let himself feel it, the loss, the grief, the unbearable weight of a future stolen before it had even begun, the quiet ache of what would never be, the sound of Sarah's breath against his chest, and the crushing weight of a silence that neither of them knew how to fill. Michael sat in the dim light of the living room, his hands resting against his knees, fingers curled loosely, his gaze fixed on nothing. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as Sarah moved in the bedroom, the sound too soft, too slow. It was past midnight now, but neither of them had slept. He had tried. For her. for whatever remained of the life they had before. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw her on the ground, curled in pain, her breath sharp and ragged, her arms wrapped protectively around the son they would never get to meet. He saw the way Calloway had laughed, the way Reeves had smirked, the way they had stood over them as if they were nothing, as if what they had done would never matter, as if there would be no consequences. Michael inhaled slowly through his nose, steady, measured, the only sign of what was building inside him, the way his fingers pressed into his knees, knuckles going white. The grief was still there, heavy and unbearable, sitting in his chest like something that could never be moved. But beneath it, something else was growing, something deeper, something colder. He had spent his entire life learning control, training for it, perfecting it. He had walked through fire, through war, through battles that should have left him dead, and he had always known how to keep himself in check, how to stay sharp, how to calculate every move before he made it. But this wasn't war. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home, and they had brought the war to him. His jaw clenched, his breath slow and deliberate as he pushed himself to his feet, his body feeling too heavy, too restrained. His gaze flicked toward the hallway, toward the closed bedroom door where Sarah was still awake, lying on her side, staring at the wall, breathing too quietly. She hadn't spoken much after they came home, had barely touched the food he made, hadn't turned on the television, hadn't reached for him again, hadn't done anything except exist in a space that no longer felt like hers. Michael exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, his jaw tightening further. He had been patient. He had let the process play out, had followed the rules, had let himself believe, if only for a moment, that the world they lived in was still one where justice existed, that if he gave it time, someone would be held accountable, someone would pay, but they wouldn't. And he had known it from the moment they locked him in that cell, from the moment he heard them laughing, from the second Calloway had looked him in the eyes and smirked, because he knew they had done this, and they would get away with it, unless... Michael's hands flexed at his sides. He swallowed, forcing himself to exhale slowly, grounding himself in the moment, forcing his mind to stay clear, to focus, to push away the instinct to move now before he had fully decided how far he was willing to go. A sound broke through the silence, the quiet shuffle of movement behind him. He turned his head slightly. Sarah stood in the hallway, wrapped in a blanket, her arms clutching it close, her eyes shadowed, her posture small, fragile. He straightened instinctively, his expression smoothing out, the sharp edges of his thoughts carefully pushed back beneath the surface. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, and for a moment he thought she might ask what he was thinking, might see the way his stance had shifted, the way his shoulders had squared, the way his entire body had begun bracing for something she wasn't ready to face. But she didn't. Her voice was quiet. "You're angry." Michael inhaled slowly, watching her, his fingers flexing again before he forced them to still. He nodded once. "Yes." Sarah studied him, her expression unreadable, her grip on the blanket tightening. "I've never seen you like this before." Michael held her gaze, steady, unwavering. "I've never felt like this before." She swallowed, her breath unsteady, her voice softer now. "I don't know what to do with it." Michael exhaled, his jaw flexing slightly. "You don't have to do anything." Sarah let out a breath that almost sounded like a broken laugh. "How can you say that?" She shook her head, her eyes shining with something raw. "I can't just sit here. I can't just exist like this, knowing they're still out there, knowing they get to go home and sleep and—" She cut herself off, her voice catching. Michael stepped forward before he could think twice about it, his hands moving to her arms, grounding her, holding her steady. She didn't pull away, but she trembled beneath his touch. He kept his voice low. "I know." She exhaled sharply, blinking rapidly, shaking her head again, her breath uneven. "Then what are we supposed to do?" Michael didn't answer right away, because he wasn't sure she was ready for the truth. Not yet. His grip on her arms tightened slightly, his voice steady. unshaken. Right now, we grieve. Sarah swallowed, her gaze flicking away, her fingers tightening in the fabric of the blanket, and for a long moment, she just stood there, breathing, struggling, trying to hold herself together. Then, finally, she nodded. Michael released her arms, his fingers lingering just slightly before dropping to his sides. Sarah stepped back, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come to bed?" Michael's jaw flexed, his hands clenching once before relaxing. He nodded once. She turned slowly, disappearing down the hall, her footsteps soft against the floor, the bedroom door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. Michael didn't move right away, didn't follow, just stood in the dim light of the living room, his breath even, controlled, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle deep into his ribs. Sarah had always been the one to keep him steady, to remind him who he was, to pull him back when the world had threatened to take too much. But now, there was no steadying this, no pulling back, no stopping what had already begun. Michael inhaled deeply, exhaled slow, closing his eyes for just a moment before turning, following the path Sarah had taken, pushing the thoughts back down, burying them beneath the grief, because for now, she needed him here. For now, she needed his anger to stay where it was. For now, but not forever, never forever. Calloway and Reeves had taken everything from him, and the world had let them do it. No one was coming for them. No one was going to knock on their doors and drag them away in cuffs. No judge was going to read their charges. No courtroom was going to hold them accountable. No system was going to weigh their sins and decide they didn't deserve to walk free, because this world didn't punish men like them. But he could. Michael exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing against his thighs, his mind already clearing, his focus sharpening, his grief turning into something else, something colder. He had spent his life following orders. He had learned control, discipline, restraint. He had spent years carrying out missions, ensuring that the world remained in balance, eliminating threats before they had the chance to grow. Now, it was time to take that knowledge and apply it to something personal. Because this was a war now, and he knew exactly how to fight a war. His movements were deliberate as he stepped away from the window, retrieving his phone from the table, his mind already working through the steps, the process, the strategy. He couldn't act yet, not without knowing everything, not without having the advantage. First, he had to find them. He pulled up the county records, his fingers steady as he navigated through the system, scanning through the names, filtering through the information. Every officer's residence was public record. If you knew where to look, if you knew how to move through databases, if you understood how systems were built, then nothing was truly hidden. It didn't take long. Calloway's name appeared first. A two-story house in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of town, just past the old industrial district. A cul-de-sac, wide driveways, neatly trimmed lawns. He lived alone. No wife, no kids, just him. Reeves was different. A rental house near the highway, close enough to the department to make his commute easy. A place that looked like it had been chosen out of convenience rather than comfort. He had a fiancée, a woman whose name meant nothing to Michael, someone who had no idea what kind of man she was living with. Michael's jaw flexed as he memorized the addresses, storing the information away in his mind. Knowing where they lived wasn't enough. He needed to watch, to learn their routines, to understand when they were vulnerable, when they were alone, when no one would come looking. He needed certainty. Michael turned off the phone, setting it back down, his breath slow, controlled, his movements precise as he grabbed his jacket from the chair. He pulled it on, feeling the weight settle over his shoulders, feeling the steadiness return to his hands. He didn't hesitate as he moved toward the door, stepping into the night, locking it behind him, his steps silent as he made his way to the truck. The air was cold, but he barely noticed it, his mind already ahead of his body, already processing the steps that would come next, the actions he would take, the nights he would spend waiting for the right moment. He wasn't angry anymore. Anger was reckless. Anger clouded judgment. This wasn't about rage. This was about justice. The kind that couldn't be given in a courtroom. The kind that couldn't be bargained or appealed. The kind that didn't care about rank or badge or power. The kind of justice that came for men in the dark when they least expected it. Michael started the truck, the engine humming low beneath the quiet of the night. He pulled out of the driveway, merging onto the road, his eyes steady, his pulse even. The war had begun, and the first battle was information. It didn't take long to find Calloway's house. Michael parked a few streets away, slipping into the shadows, moving with the kind of precision that came from years of training. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people locked their doors, but never truly worried about what lurked outside. He moved carefully, keeping to the edges, scanning the property, memorizing the layout. A single car in the driveway, the house dark except for a faint glow coming from an upstairs window. Calloway was home, alone. Michael exhaled slowly, settling into the darkness, his body still, his mind calculating. He would watch, he would wait, because men like Calloway always thought they were untouchable, and that was their first mistake. Reeves was next. Michael tracked his house the same way, parking near an abandoned lot, moving through the shadows, studying every detail. The lights were on inside, movement visible through the windows. His fiancée was home, laughing at something on the television, oblivious to the kind of man she had chosen. Michael watched for a long time. Reeves came home late, his body language loose, relaxed, his routine careless. He wasn't worried. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He had no reason to believe that anything in his world had changed. Michael exhaled slowly, watching him step inside, the door closing behind him, locking out the night, for now. Michael turned, disappearing into the dark, his steps silent, his mind already cataloging everything, already preparing for what came next. Because soon, very soon, both Calloway and Reeves would learn what it felt like to be hunted. Michael moved through the house in silence, the dim glow from the kitchen the only source of light as he gathered what he needed, his motions slow, methodical, deliberate. Every movement had purpose. Every breath was controlled. His mind had settled into something sharp, something honed, something unshakable. The past few nights had been spent watching, studying, learning. He had tracked their routines, memorized the way Calloway came home late, alone, moving without care, without the slightest hesitation. He had watched how Reeves barely checked his surroundings, how he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed nothing could ever touch him. They were easy targets, careless, comfortable, and Michael knew from experience. Comfort bred vulnerability. The system had failed, as he had always known it would. No one had come for them. No suspensions, no investigations, not even a headline on the news. They had gone right back to their lives without consequence, returning to their routines as if Ethan's life had meant nothing. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, feeling the weight of the last week settle deep in his chest, pressing against his ribs, twisting in his gut. The grief was still there, heavy, unrelenting. It would never leave. But the time for grief was over. The time for action had begun. He reached for the box on the counter, fingers steady as he flipped it open, revealing the neatly arranged contents inside. It wasn't much, just a collection of tools. Items that on their own meant little but together became something else entirely. Gloves, rope, duct tape, a burner phone, and a weapon. One that he had owned for years, tucked away, untouched, waiting for a purpose. That purpose had arrived. Michael let out a slow breath, his mind running through the plan again, refining every step, ensuring there would be no room for error. He had spent enough time observing. Now it was time to execute. Calloway would be first. It had to be him, the one who had smiled while pressing him into the pavement, the one who had mocked Sarah, the one who had let it all happen like it was funny. Michael had decided early on, this wouldn't be quick. Death was too easy. He needed Calloway to understand. Michael reached for the map he had drawn out, laying it flat against the counter, his gaze sweeping over the familiar streets, the routes he had traced a dozen times in his head. Calloway's house was in an area with limited streetlights, a quiet cul-de-sac with only one way in and one way out. His car was always parked in the driveway. No cameras, no security system, no one watching. A perfect trap. Michael tapped a finger against the edge of the map, his expression unreadable, his pulse steady, his breath even. He had planned operations in war zones with less information than this. This was easy, because Calloway wasn't expecting it. Michael had already walked the neighborhood, blending into the dark, ensuring there were no stray obstacles, no unexpected variables. He had studied the angles, calculated the timing, determined the precise moment when Calloway would be most vulnerable, right after he got home, before he locked the door, when he still believed himself untouchable. Michael rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar pull of tension in his muscles, the anticipation settling into his bones. He had spent his whole life being a soldier. Now, for the first time, he was something else, a hunter. His fingers curled around the gloves, sliding them on, the material fitting snugly against his skin. The burner phone was next, slipping into his pocket, already prepped with everything he needed. Then, finally, he reached for the weapon. He hadn't fired it in years, hadn't needed to, hadn't wanted to, but the weight was still familiar, the grip settling into his palm like it belonged there, like it had never left. Michael exhaled slowly, pressing the safety off, his body relaxing with the motion, his mind sharpening further. The clock on the stove read just past midnight. Calloway would be home in an hour. Michael turned, stepping into the dark, leaving the house in silence, his mind already ahead of his body, already moving through every action, already seeing the moment unfold. Because by the time the sun rose, Calloway would feel real pain, and justice, at last, would begin. The night wrapped around Michael like an old companion, familiar and steady, whispering promises of justice, long overdue. He moved through the darkness of Calloway's backyard, his steps silent, his breathing slow, his pulse as steady as it had ever been. The house loomed ahead, the back door locked, the windows closed. But Michael had already prepared for this. The lock-picking set fit easily into his palm as he crouched near the back door, working with the precision of a man who had done this before. The tumblers gave way without resistance, the lock shifting, the door creaking open just enough for him to slip inside. He closed it softly behind him, standing still for a moment, letting the sounds of the house settle around him, listening for anything unexpected. Nothing. Calloway wasn't home yet. Good. Michael exhaled slowly, moving through the house with careful, calculated steps. It was exactly as he expected. Neat, structured, impersonal. Furniture that looked expensive but untouched. A bar cart stocked with liquor he probably only poured when trying to impress someone. A home built not for comfort, but for image. Michael scanned the space, setting the scene. The world needed to believe this was a robbery. He moved through the living room, pulling drawers open just enough to create the illusion of a search, knocking over a lamp, shifting the bar cart, placing objects at angles that suggested someone had been in a hurry, rummaging through belongings without concern. It needed to look real. It needed to feel real. By the time Calloway walked through the door, he had to believe this was nothing more than bad luck. That would make it so much better. Michael positioned himself near the hallway, disappearing into the darkened corner just past the kitchen, a perfect vantage point of the entryway. Then he waited. Calloway arrived on schedule, his car rolling into the driveway at exactly 1:15 a.m., just as Michael had expected. He stepped out, moving with that same easy arrogance, walking toward the front door without a single glance over his shoulder. He didn't check his surroundings, didn't hesitate, didn't consider, even for a second, that someone might be waiting inside. Michael exhaled slowly, watching. The lock turned. The door creaked open. Then, silence. Calloway's body stiffened, his head tilted, his shoulders squaring as his gaze swept over the mess Michael had created, the open drawers, the knocked-over lamp, the slight disarray of the room. His lips parted slightly, his breath catching, his entire posture shifting from casual to alert. His fingers twitched near his belt, but he wasn't wearing his holster. Michael could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind. Burglary. Home invasion. Was the intruder still here? Michael let the fear settle, let it seep into Calloway's limbs, let it wrap around his ribs like an invisible vice. Then, when the moment was just right, when Calloway's mind was still trying to decide what to do, Michael struck. The first hit came hard, fast, a precise blow to the back of the head with the butt of his weapon, sending Calloway stumbling forward, his phone slipping from his fingers, hitting the ground with a sharp crack. Before Calloway could recover, before he could process what was happening, Michael was on him. A fist to the ribs, hard, deep, crushing, forcing the air from Calloway's lungs in a strangled gasp. Another hit, this time to the stomach, doubling him over, his knees nearly buckling, his body folding into itself as he struggled to breathe. Michael didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He grabbed Calloway by the back of his shirt, yanking him upright before driving his knee into his gut with brutal efficiency. Calloway gagged, his body jerking, his limbs flailing, his breath choking out in short, panicked bursts. He wasn't fighting back. He couldn't. Michael shoved him forward, sending him crashing against the coffee table, knocking over the liquor bottles, the glass shattering across the floor. Calloway groaned, his body twisting, his fingers clawing against the surface, struggling to push himself up. Michael watched him for a second, tilting his head slightly, feeling the rush of adrenaline steady, controlled, purposeful. This wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. Calloway gasped, his body shaking, his hands trembling as he tried to gather himself, but Michael moved before he could, gripping the back of his head, slamming his face against the floor. A muffled grunt, the crack of bone against hardwood, a sharp inhale of pain. Michael exhaled slowly. Calloway's breath came in ragged bursts now, his body limp beneath Michael's grip. The last bit of fight draining from him, the first real flicker of terror setting in. Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out the zip ties, yanking Calloway's arms behind his back, securing them with practiced ease. The plastic bit into his skin, locking his wrists together, the tension tight enough to cut off circulation. Michael knelt beside him, tilting his head slightly, studying him. Calloway was still gasping, his forehead pressed against the floor, his body shaking, his mind struggling to catch up, to process, to understand. But he wouldn't, not yet, because, to him, this was just a robbery gone wrong. Michael let that sink in. Let Calloway believe it. Let his brain work through the possibilities. Let his fear expand into something raw and overwhelming. Calloway swallowed hard, his voice hoarse, shaking. Take whatever you want. His breath hitched. Just go. Michael stayed silent. There were things he wanted to say. He wanted to tell Calloway that he knew what it was like to be pinned down, to have a knee pressing into his back, to feel helpless while the people he loved suffered. He wanted to tell him that every bruise he had left on Sarah, every second she had spent lying on the ground in pain, every breath their son had never gotten to take, Michael was returning all of it, piece by piece, second by second, making sure Calloway felt it. But he couldn't say those things. Not yet. Because this wasn't about him. This was about fear. Michael reached for the edge of the couch, dragging a pillow onto the floor, pressing it next to Calloway's face. A muffled, choked noise of confusion. Then, Michael pressed down. Calloway's body bucked instinctively, a sharp, strangled gasp escaping him as the fabric cut off his air, his lungs seizing in panic. His legs kicked, his fingers twitched uselessly, his muscles straining against the zip ties. Michael held firm. Not long, just enough to make Calloway feel it. Then he released. Calloway gasped violently, sucking in air, coughing so hard his entire body shook. Michael stayed perfectly still, watching, waiting, letting the moment sink in, letting the fear settle into Calloway's bones, letting him know. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet, stepping back into the shadows, leaving Calloway tied, battered, and waiting. The scene was perfect. By the time someone found him, he would be humiliated, broken, stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. And the best part? He would never even suspect who had done it. Michael exhaled slowly, disappearing into the night, the weight in his chest lighter than it had been in days. One down, one to go. Michael stepped through the front door just as the first streaks of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the faintest glow bleeding through the blinds, casting thin shadows across the floor. The house was still, silent, the kind of quiet that stretched too deep, settling into the walls, pressing against his skin like something tangible. His movements were careful, deliberate, closing the door without a sound, slipping off his jacket, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension that had settled there hours ago. The adrenaline had faded, but the weight of what he had done lingered in his bones, in the raw ache of his knuckles, in the way his breath still came a little too slow, a little too controlled. He had done it. And for the first time since that night, since the hospital, since the moment he had stood outside the station, holding Sarah as she whispered that their son was gone, he felt something other than grief. Not peace, not relief, but something. And then he felt her eyes on him. Sarah was standing at the end of the hall, wrapped in one of his old sweatshirts, her bare feet silent against the hardwood, her arms crossed over her chest. She wasn't asleep. She hadn't been, not since that night. And now, as she watched him, her gaze moving over him in that slow, assessing way she had always done when she knew something, when she was waiting for him to admit it, Michael exhaled, already knowing there was no point in trying to hide it. She didn't move, didn't speak right away, just let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy, the kind that carried more weight than words ever could. Then, finally, quietly, "You did something." Michael held her gaze, steady, unwavering, his hands flexing at his sides before he forced them to still. "Yes." Sarah inhaled slowly, her fingers curling against her sleeves. "Did you kill him?" Michael shook his head. "No." She studied him for a moment, searching his expression, looking for something, anything, that would tell her what he wasn't saying. But he had never been easy to read, not when he didn't want to be. "Then what did you do?" Her voice was calm, too calm. Michael exhaled, running a hand over his jaw before stepping closer, his tone low, steady. "I made sure he understood." Sarah didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. She knew him, knew what that meant. Her breath hitched just slightly, her fingers twitching at her sides, something unreadable flickering across her face, before settling into something else. She swallowed. And did it help? Michael didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he didn't know. The rage hadn't faded. The ache in his chest hadn't lifted. The grief hadn't loosened its grip. But Calloway had felt fear, and that was something. Michael exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now. "It's not over." Sarah nodded once, barely a movement, her gaze steady, unreadable. "Reeves." Michael's jaw tightened. "Yes." Another stretch of silence. Sarah glanced away briefly, her hands tightening around the fabric of her sleeves before she looked back up at him. "I want to be there." Michael stilled. He had expected her to ask why, to argue, to tell him that this wasn't the answer, that there was still another way, that justice wasn't his to take. But she hadn't. And now, she was asking for something he hadn't anticipated. He studied her, the way her shoulders were drawn back, the way her voice hadn't wavered, the way there was no hesitation in her words, only something resolute. "Sarah," he said slowly, carefully. She shook her head before he could finish, before he could tell her she didn't have to. that this wasn't her burden to carry. I need to be there. Michael exhaled, watching her, weighing everything, letting the gravity of what she was asking settle deep. This wasn't just revenge for him anymore. It wasn't just his war. It was theirs. He nodded once, and that was all she needed. She turned, walking past him, heading toward the bedroom, leaving him standing there in the quiet, in the thin morning light, in the space where the last remnants of hesitation had finally, fully disappeared. No more restraint, no more waiting, no more turning back. By the time this was over, the officers would know what he had taken from them, and he would never forget. Michael stood in the quiet stillness of the kitchen, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, the only sound in the house. The weight of the night clung to him, settling deep into his muscles, wrapping itself around his bones, refusing to fade. He had expected some kind of release, some kind of shift, some moment where the fury burned out, leaving only silence in its place, but it hadn't come, and maybe it never would. Across the room, Sarah's voice broke through the quiet, her tone steady, measured. It's not enough. Michael lifted his gaze to hers, studying the way she stood, arms folded, shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. She wasn't asking. She wasn't questioning. She was stating it. Michael exhaled, slow and controlled. He had known this moment was coming. From the second she had told him she wanted to be there for the next one, he had understood. This wasn't just about Calloway. It wasn't just about one lesson. It was about making sure they would never forget. Sarah's fingers curled against her sleeves, her gaze unwavering. They'll recover. They'll lick their wounds, tell themselves it was random. Calloway won't admit what really happened. Reeves will tell himself it was a fluke. And the others, the ones who stood by and watched, who let it happen, who laughed while they did it, they'll still think they're safe. Her voice was quiet, but there was something sharp beneath it, something raw, something that hadn't been there before. Michael nodded once. We change that. Sarah inhaled slowly, the faintest flicker of something dark passing through her expression. We make sure they know they're never safe. Michael exhaled, his hands resting on the table, fingers flexing slightly before going still. We tell them. Sarah tilted her head slightly, waiting. Michael straightened, his voice calm, even. Reeves will be next. And when we're done, we let him know what happens if he ever lays a hand on someone again. Sarah nodded, absorbing that, processing. And Calloway? Michael's jaw flexed. Reeves will tell him, because Reeves would break faster than Calloway. Reeves was reckless, temperamental, a man who thrived on control, but cracked the moment he lost it. He wouldn't be able to keep it to himself, maybe not right away, maybe not in front of his fellow officers, but eventually, when the paranoia sank in, when the sleepless nights stretched too long, when the fear took root, he would talk, and Calloway would listen. Sarah's lips pressed together, her breath slow and deliberate. So we don't stop with just them. Michael met her gaze, steady. No, because this wasn't just about Calloway and Reeves anymore. It was about every man who had ever stood beside them. It was about all of them. Sarah exhaled, nodding once, something hardening behind her eyes. Good. Michael studied her for a long moment, watching the way her fingers twitched slightly, the way her shoulders remained squared, the way she hadn't looked away. There was no hesitation, no fear, just purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This belonged to both of them. Sarah shifted slightly, inhaling deeply before speaking again, her voice softer now, but no less certain. I want to be the one to tell him. Michael stilled, his breath steady, controlled. Reeves? Sarah nodded. When we're done, Michael exhaled slowly, considering, processing, letting the weight of her words settle into the space between them. Then, finally, he nodded. Sarah turned away, walking toward the hallway, her footsteps silent against the floor. Michael watched her go, standing in the stillness, listening to the soft rustle of fabric as she disappeared into the bedroom. Then he turned toward the table, reaching for his jacket, feeling the weight settle over his shoulders once more. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Not for them. Not for Calloway. Not for Reeves, because fear, true fear, wasn't just in the moment. It was in the silence afterward. It was in the long nights. It was in the seconds before sleep took hold, in the footsteps heard too close behind, in the glance over the shoulder that never quite found anything until the day it did. And now, for the rest of their lives, that fear would belong to them. Michael and Sarah had prepared for this moment with precision. 2 nights of watching, waiting, memorizing Reeves's habits. He wasn't as reckless as Calloway, but he had the same arrogance, the same blind confidence that made men like him easy targets. The bar was his weakness, a small, dimly lit dive just outside of town, tucked away from main roads. It was a place where cops like him gathered, a place where they could drink, laugh, and share stories of what they had done to people who couldn't fight back. But Reeves had stayed later than usual tonight. Alone. No one was waiting for him. No one would come looking. Michael and Sarah watched from the alley behind the building, their car parked 2 streets away, out of sight of any cameras. They had already mapped out his routine. He would leave through the back, take one last smoke beside his car, check his phone, and drive home. Except tonight, he wasn't going home. Michael adjusted his gloves, exhaling slowly. Sarah stood beside him, her breath even, her focus sharp. Then, right on schedule, Reeves stepped out. He barely glanced around, his movements relaxed, comfortable. He rolled his shoulders, pulling a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a flick of his lighter. The glow flashed across his face for just a moment, before vanishing into the dark. Michael moved first. His steps were silent, his approach precise. Reeves didn't hear him. Not until it was too late. Michael struck fast, his arm wrapped around Reeves's throat, locking in tight, his other hand pressing against the back of his head, cutting off his chance to scream, to fight back. Reeves let out a choked gasp, his hands flying up, clawing at Michael's arm, his body jerking violently in a desperate attempt to break free. But Michael had done this before. Many times. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly how long it would take for the struggle to weaken. Sarah was already there, moving quickly, pressing a thick cloth over Reeves's face, pulling it tight, blinding him completely. Reeves panicked. His breathing turned frantic, his movements more erratic, his body thrashing with wild desperation. Michael tightened his grip. "Stop fighting!" Reeves didn't listen. He tried to kick out, tried to drive his elbow backward, but Sarah moved first. A sharp strike to the back of his leg sent him buckling, his knee hitting the pavement hard, a strangled noise escaping him. Michael used the moment to force Reeves's hands behind his back, securing them with zip ties, yanking them tight enough to bite into his skin. Sarah wrapped another restraint around his ankles, locking them together. Reeves gasped, struggling uselessly. Who are you?" Michael shoved him forward, pressing him flat against the car, his knee digging into Reeves's spine, his voice calm. "Quiet." Reeves tensed beneath him, his breath coming fast, ragged. Michael held him there for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the reality of his situation settle in. Then, without another word, he and Sarah lifted him together, dragging him from the lot, away from his car, away from the world he had always known. His muffled protests turned into choked, panicked sounds, but he wasn't in control anymore. And for the first time in his life, he knew it. They didn't take him far. The location had already been chosen. An abandoned auto shop just outside of town, its walls covered in graffiti, its roof caving in on one side, the ground littered with shattered glass and broken concrete. It had been forgotten by the world. No cameras, no witnesses, no one to hear him scream. Michael and Sarah drove in silence. Reeves lay in the back, bound, blindfolded, his body shifting with every turn, every bump in the road. His breathing had slowed, but Michael could hear it. The fear, the way it settled in his chest, the way it turned his frantic movements into something more controlled, more calculating. He was trying to think his way out, trying to figure out what kind of men had taken him, trying to decide if this was about money, if this was about revenge. Michael said nothing, neither did Sarah. Letting him sit in the dark, in the silence, was more effective than anything they could say. By the time they pulled into the lot, Reeves had stopped struggling altogether. Michael killed the engine. Sarah glanced at him once, her expression unreadable, but she didn't hesitate as she opened her door. Michael did the same. Then, together, they pulled Reeves from the back, his body jerking at the sudden movement. He kicked out, his breath hitching, but the restraints held. Michael and Sarah exchanged a look. Then, they dragged him inside. The air was stale, cold. A single flickering overhead bulb cast jagged shadows against the walls, illuminating the dust in the air. The room was empty except for the remnants of old machinery, rusted workbenches, and forgotten tools scattered across the floor. Michael and Sarah dropped Reeves onto the concrete, letting him hit the ground hard enough to rattle him, to remind him of his place. He groaned, twisting onto his side, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The mask still covered his face, keeping him lost in the dark. Michael watched him for a moment. Then he crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees, tilting his head slightly. Reeves lay completely still. Michael could hear it. The waiting, the moment before the storm. Reeves's fingers twitched against the restraints. He swallowed hard. Then his voice came, hoarse, strained. "What do you want?" Michael didn't answer. Sarah moved beside him, crossing her arms, exhaling slowly. Michael reached out, gripping Reeves's shoulder, rolling him onto his back, letting his head rest against the cold floor. He could feel the tension in him, the silent effort it took for him to keep his breathing even, to stay still. Michael leaned in slightly, his voice quiet. "Not so fun, being on this side of things, is it?" Reeves didn't speak. Michael tilted his head. "I know you're thinking, trying to figure out who we are, why you're here." Reeves swallowed again. I don't." Michael pressed a hand against his chest, just enough to make his breath hitch. "But the problem is, you've done this to too many people to know which one of them finally came back." Silence. Sarah's voice came next, quiet, edged with something cold. "And that's the part that should scare you the most." Reeves's breathing turned shallow. Michael leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Because it means you'll never know who's watching." Reeves flinched. Michael let the silence stretch again, let the weight of his words settle, let the realization coil around Reeves's spine like a vice. Then he stood, rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers, loosening his stance. Because now, it was time to make him feel it. The air in the abandoned auto shop was thick with dust, the cold concrete beneath Reeves's body sending a dull ache through his already stiff limbs. He had stopped struggling by now, his breath slow, measured, as though he had finally begun accepting the reality of what was happening. But Michael knew better. He had seen men like Reeves before, men who thought that if they could just hold on long enough, if they could just endure long enough, they might find a way out. Michael stepped forward, the rubber soles of his boots scraping softly against the floor, his breath even, his muscles loose. Sarah stood beside him, her stance strong, steady. She had been quiet, watching, waiting, letting the moment settle, letting the weight of what they were about to do sink in. Reeves flinched slightly at the sound of Michael's approach, his body tensing. He still couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't fight back. Michael crouched down beside him, his voice quiet, calm, like a conversation between old friends. "You think if you stay quiet, if you hold out, this will end faster for you." Reeves swallowed, the tension in his body obvious now. Michael tilted his head slightly. "That's not how this works." Then he hit him. The punch landed clean, sharp, precise. A calculated strike to the ribs, forcing a strangled gasp from Reeves's throat. His body jerked involuntarily, but the restraints kept him in place, his hands bound, his legs useless beneath him. Michael straightened, shaking out his fingers, Watching as Reeves wheezed, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, Sarah stepped forward. She didn't hesitate. Her first hit landed hard, her knuckles striking the side of his jaw with a force that snapped his head to the side. Reeves let out a pained grunt, his shoulders curling inward, his body instinctively trying to protect itself. But there was nowhere to go. She hit him again. And again. Every strike was fueled by something deeper than anger, something raw, something that had been building inside her since the night she had lain on the ground, cradling the son that had been stolen from them. Michael didn't stop her. This was hers as much as it was his. When she finally pulled back, her breath came in slow, steady exhales. Reeves groaned, his head hanging forward, his breath ragged, his body shaking from the impact of the blows. Michael crouched again, his voice quiet but firm. "Listen to me, Reeves." He reached out, gripping the front of the man's shirt, yanking him just slightly forward, forcing him to listen. "You can never admit what happened here, because if you do, if you tell them what we did to you, they'll have to ask why." Reeves's breath hitched, his shoulders going rigid. Michael leaned in just slightly, his grip tightening. "And if they ask why, they'll have to look at every single one of your arrests, every traffic stop, every case that went through because you said so." Reeves let out a slow, shuddering breath. Michael could feel it. The moment understanding replaced whatever false hope had still been clinging to him. Michael exhaled, his voice softer now, but no less dangerous. "And the same goes for Calloway." Reeves's hands twitched against the restraints. Michael tilted his head. "You already know what happened to him, don't you?" Reeves didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Michael knew. The moment Reeves was taken, the department would have started whispering. Calloway would have been found by now, humiliated, shaken, scared. And fear like that spreads. Sarah stepped forward again, crouching beside Michael, her voice sharp, cutting. "That's why you'll keep your mouth shut. That's why you'll get up tomorrow and pretend nothing happened. Because if you open that door, everything comes out." Reeves swallowed hard, his breath unsteady, his entire body trembling now. Michael released his grip, standing slowly, rolling his shoulders, flexing his fingers. "You will never know when we're watching. You will never know if we're near." Sarah straightened beside him, her voice low, edged with finality. "But if you ever do this again," she let the words settle, let them sink deep into Reeves's mind, into his bones. "We will come back." Michael turned, already walking toward the exit, already leaving Reeves behind. Sarah lingered for half a second longer. Then, without another word, she followed. Reeves would free himself eventually. And when he did, when he stumbled into the night, battered and broken, when he looked over his shoulder every single day for the rest of his life, that was when justice would truly begin. Because it wasn't about the beating. It wasn't about the bruises. It was about the fear. A fear that would never leave him. A fear that belonged to all of them now. And Michael and Sarah, they would make sure it never faded. The sun had barely risen when the call came in. A patrol officer found him first, stumbling through the empty lot just outside the abandoned auto shop, his uniform torn, his face swollen and bloodied, his breathing ragged. He had freed himself at some point during the night, but it had taken too long, his body weak from the beating, his mind drowning in fear. The officer who found him barely recognized him at first. Reeves, once a man who had walked with a smug, unshaken confidence, was now a trembling, broken shell. The department moved quickly. They had to. By the time the morning shift had started, word had already spread. 2 officers attacked, both found bound and bruised in separate incidents. One was bad enough, but 2? That meant something worse. That meant it wasn't random. That meant it wasn't a coincidence. That meant someone had come for them. The station was quieter than usual. The weight of paranoia settling into the walls, pressing against the backs of every officer inside. No one spoke it aloud, but they were thinking it. Who did this? Who's next? Reeves sat in the station's medical room, his knuckles resting against his thighs, his head bowed, his face a mess of bruises and dried blood. He had barely said a word since they found him. He hadn't reported a suspect, hadn't filed an official statement, hadn't given any details. Because, what could he say? That he had been dragged into the dark? That he had been beaten, threatened, left with nothing but fear, and a warning he knew he couldn't ignore? He could still hear their voices, their words curling inside his skull, pressing into the places where his arrogance had once been. You will never know when we're watching. You will never know if we're near. But if you ever do this again, we will come back. His hands curled into fists, the pain shooting through his body, a reminder that they had meant every single word. And Calloway? He hadn't spoken either. The department had found him tied up in his own house, his wrists raw from the restraints, his face humiliated, his anger simmering beneath the surface. But when asked what happened, he had only shaken his head. He knew if he admitted what had been done to him, if he said anything, it would open a door that the department couldn't afford to look through. Because then they would have to ask questions. They would have to check. And if they checked, they would find the cases, the ones that never should have held up in court, the arrests that relied solely on their word, the complaints that had been buried before they could be investigated. Michael had been right. They had done this too many times. So many times, they couldn't even count. And now, the weight of every single one of those moments sat on their backs, pressing down, threatening to crush them. Reeves's breath came slow and unsteady, his mind running over every possible outcome, every move he could make. But no matter which way he turned, it always led to the same place: silence. Because no matter what happened now, no matter how much it burned him to sit here, to pretend, to act like he wasn't afraid, he was. And that fear, that was forever. By noon, the entire department had fallen into quiet tension. Officers moved carefully, glancing over their shoulders, speaking in hushed tones. No one knew what to do, how to react. The ones who had been laughing just days ago, the ones who had stood beside Calloway and Reeves, who had let it happen, were no longer smiling. Because it wasn't just two men who had been attacked. It was the entire idea of them. Someone had sent a message, and the worst part? No one knew who. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no leads, just two officers who had spent their careers making people afraid, now forced to feel what it was like to be powerless. And as much as they wanted to deny it, to pretend it was just a one-time thing, a random act of violence, deep down, every single one of them knew it wasn't random, and it wasn't over. Michael sat in the living room, the television muted, the news broadcast rolling silently across the screen. The words were there. Two officers assaulted in separate incidents, but he didn't need to hear them. He could see everything he needed in the way they spoke, in the way the reporters carefully chose their words, in the way the department's public relations officer avoided looking directly at the camera. They didn't know what to say, because they had never been on this side of it before. Sarah sat beside him, her posture relaxed, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. She had barely spoken since they got back, but she hadn't needed to. The tension that had been weighing on them for weeks had shifted into something else, something colder, something final. Michael exhaled slowly, watching as the news rolled on, as images of the police station flickered across the screen. Officers walking in and out, their expressions guarded. The department was afraid, and fear was a powerful thing. Sarah leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. They'll never admit it. Michael nodded. They don't have to. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. Do you think they understand? Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, finally, he nodded. They understand. Sarah exhaled, the smallest flicker of something like relief settling into her expression. Good. Michael watched her for a moment, studying the way her shoulders had loosened, The way she wasn't carrying the same weight she had been before. She wasn't healed. Neither of them were. But this was the beginning. He reached over, intertwining his fingers with hers, feeling the warmth of her hand, the steadiness of it. They had done what they came to do. And now they would wait, because the fear they had planted, it would never fade. Not for Calloway. Not for Reeves. Not for any of them. Calloway sat in the dim light of his living room, the television flickering in the background, the sound low, a dull hum that barely registered through the pounding in his skull. He barely slept anymore. The headaches hadn't stopped since the night he had been found, tied up, humiliated, stripped of everything he had once thought made him untouchable. The doctors called it a severe concussion, said it could take months, years even, for the symptoms to fade. They hadn't faded. The dizziness came in waves, unpredictable, making it impossible to focus for too long, making him sick if he moved too fast. The ringing in his ears never stopped, a constant, high-pitched reminder that his world had changed forever. The pressure in his skull was unbearable some days, making it impossible to think clearly, to form thoughts the way he used to. And the worst part? The fear. It was always there, sitting at the edge of his mind, tightening around his throat in the dead of night, gripping his chest when he heard footsteps outside his window, when he saw a car parked too long down the street, when he stepped outside his front door and felt the weight of unseen eyes. Watching him, he knew they were still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. He had tried to go back to work, but that was impossible now. The concussions had left him sluggish, his reaction time slow, his ability to focus non-existent. He couldn't be trusted in the field, couldn't be relied on to make the split-second decisions that once gave him power. They hadn't fired him outright, not yet, but they had taken his badge, put him on indefinite leave, pushed him into the background like an embarrassment they didn't know how to deal with. Reeves was worse. He had been found kneeling on the cold ground, beaten, bound, humiliated. His face had been swollen for days, his ribs cracked, his body wrecked beyond what the department could ignore. But it wasn't just the physical damage, it was the fear. He had been paranoid before, but now, he barely left his house. He had quit the force, handed in his resignation without a fight, without a word of protest, without the same arrogance that had once defined him. He hadn't shown up to the bar since that night, hadn't been seen at any of the places he used to frequent, hadn't even answered the calls from the few officers who still tried to reach him. Because what could he say? That someone had come for him? That they had made him feel powerless? That for the first time in his life, he had understood what it meant to be at someone else's mercy? He couldn't, because to admit it would mean admitting that he had spent his entire career doing the same thing to others, and he couldn't face that. Not now, not ever. So he stayed inside, trapped in his own mind, trapped in the nightmare that played over and over again. The sound of their voices, the weight of their fists, the feeling of knowing he would never see them coming if they ever decided to return. And that was what made it perfect. Because Michael and Sarah didn't need to come back, the fear would never leave them. It would haunt them in their waking hours, in the spaces between sleep and consciousness, in the corners of their minds where paranoia grew like a disease. And that was justice, not just the broken bones, not just the ruined careers, but the knowing that no matter how much time passed, no matter how hard they tried to convince themselves it was over, it never would be. The house was quiet. Sarah sat curled up on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her gaze distant, watching the soft flicker of the candle on the table. The news had already moved on. The department had no suspects, no leads, no one to charge. It had become an unsolved mystery, something whispered about but never spoken aloud. And that was exactly how it needed to be. Michael stood at the kitchen counter, leaning against it, his gaze fixed on her, watching, waiting. They had done what they came to do. The men responsible had been dismantled, their lives shattered, their power erased, but the ache inside them hadn't left. Sarah exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the mug. I should feel better. Michael walked over, sitting beside her, resting his forearms on his knees, his voice low. You do. She shook her head, her lips pressing together. Not completely. Michael was quiet for a long moment, letting the silence settle between them, letting her words sit without rushing to dismiss them, because she was right. The pain hadn't disappeared. Nothing would bring Ethan back. Nothing would erase the memories of that night, the sound of her crying, the way the world had stopped when they told them there was nothing they could do. But this was something. Michael reached over, taking her hand in his, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steadiness in her fingers. We didn't do this to feel better. Sarah exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I know. Michael squeezed her hand gently. We did it, so they would never do it again. Sarah nodded, her breath evening out, the weight on her chest loosening just slightly. They would never be whole again, but they were still standing, together. And the men who had tried to take everything from them, they would never stand again. And that was enough, for now. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.